So I'm a chronic entrepreneur, meaning that I've got this kind of disease that has gone into remission every now and then. I would taught for game design for a while. I led Virgin Poker in London for a couple of years. But really what has inspired me is startups. I started mentoring startups back in 2012, Techstars at Microsoft Ventures and a couple other programs. And it led me to some really cool startups. One of them, actually, I mentored Lean Plum back when they were two guys in Seattle. Really exciting. And I also mentored Lingvist, which is the company where I am today. To put it in perspective, we're a lot smaller than a lot of people here, I think. So we're 36 people based in this little tiny country of Estonia in the northeast corner of Europe. Also offices in London and in an entity in the US. But I joined Lingvist 4.5 years ago as the chief product officer, and then I built up the product team and then moved over to growth as we started to monetize and tried to figure out our way in the commercial world. So Estonia is a really interesting country. It's basically 1.3 million people. It's about the size of Switzerland. So to put that in context, San Francisco is about 900,000 people just in the city alone. So basically the entire country is about less than 1.5 times the size of San Francisco. But it's a very unique place. It surprised me in a lot of ways. Some of the fastest, cheapest internet. Hold on to your seats. I pay $60 a month to have super fast internet for 5 devices, pretty much as much data as I can eat. And it's gorgeous. Literally has this kind of medieval kind of village look. It's incredibly safe, the safest city I've ever lived in, and all these things, and fantastic developers. And all these things make it a remarkable area for startups. And it's got a fantastic startup ecosystem. And it's had a few unicorns, some companies you may have heard of. Maybe Lingvist will be there at some point. So what is Lingvist? You guys are probably familiar with apps like Duolingo. That's probably the easiest way to think of us, but we're a little different. We're aimed a little bit more at an intermediate audience, somebody who is really committed to learning a language and wants to do it really, really fast. The company was started by the kind of boy wonder scientist of Estonia named Mait Muntel. He was at CERN for about a decade. He was actually on the team that won the Nobel Prize for physics by discovering the Higgs boson particle. And while he lived at CERN, he had this kind of idea. He was kind of a lonely existence, didn't speak any French, and decided that he could use some of the machine learning algorithms basically that they used to find the Higgs boson or to prove the Higgs boson to teach himself French. So he built himself a tool using spaced repetition. I'll come back to that. And he passed a French proficiency test in about 2 months. Usually takes about 10 years of prep. Now, he's a really smart guy, but it does work on mortal people as well. So he's got this vision of making learning 10 times faster. We actually measure how much people learn on the platform and compare it to our competitors. We're somewhere in the kind of 4x at this point, and we think there's a lot of headroom. So we actually think this is possible. So this next slide, I want to show you what my life at Lingvist looks like, working with Mait and the team that he's assembled. So basically, this is me, right? Like, I feel like Marty, basically trying to kind of drive business metrics when, we've got this much larger, grander vision. And to Mike's credit, he's a quick learner and he's interested in this kind of stuff, but it's clearly not where his passion is. So anyway, that's just a little of my pain and and to be honest, why I like Lingvist as opposed to kind of very, very commercially focused companies. All right, so here's what I'm going to talk about in this talk. I've got kind of 4 sections. One is surfers and grinders. One is growth loops, loop or die. I'm going to talk about our creative process that we built and how that impacted ROAS over time and how it led us to a paid user acquisition loop. And then last but not least, kind of a product-focused talk, a section on activation. So first, let's start with surfers and grinders. This is just an arbitrary distinction that came to me the other day. I feel like there's kind of 2 types of growth periods, right? You've got kind of this surfer situation where you're literally trying to kind of manage and sustain massive growth. And I've never had the fortune of actually being part of a startup that has gone through this, but I've mentored many of them. And they basically describe it as, just kind of hanging on like you would surfing a wave. You're basically trying to keep the servers up. You're trying to hire as fast as you can. You're trying to plug holes, and you kind of have this like massive fire hose mentality where you're going, okay, how do we survive this, and then how do we sustain it? And I put this in here just so you could have another mnemonic for the surf zone. I thought it was a great meme. And I realized, we have a slightly different font, so some things are going to be cut off here, but that's okay. So the practice, grinders on the other hand, is really about slow, incremental improvement over time. It really happens mostly in this bottom section before you hit an inflection point, while you're trying to kind of build your way to inflection point. And then sometimes also at the top after you've gone through this period where you're trying to kind of recapture that kind of period of exponential growth. I saw this quote by Fred Wilson, and it made me feel really good about myself, which is, given a choice between a flashy operator and a grinder, I'll take a grinder every time. If you look at the results from grinding it out over a long enough time frame, you can see the power of that approach. And this has been kind of my mantra for a while, because I'll share with you, this is Lingvist's, there we go. Lingvist's average ROAS for every month for the past 2 years on UAC. So this is not our Facebook campaigns, but these are UAC campaigns where we spent actually most of our money in this period of time. And over this 2-year period, there's no hockey stick there, but there is significant, steady increases, right? In fact, about 6% month on month, about 400% over 2 years. Now, of course, it's not too hard to get 400% growth when you start really low, but as you can see, we're actually maybe now starting to hit an inflection point. But it took us probably 1.5 years before we had profitable UA campaigns, and we didn't give up. So that'll give you kind of a context. If you guys are already like way ahead of us, you may find a lot of this talk a little bit mundane. But for those who are maybe in startups and for those who are kind of earlier in their cycle, I hope this is valuable. So the second thing, loop or die. I'm curious, has anyone here done Reforge courses? Okay, cool, a few people. Anyway, I believe in giving credit where credit is due. I got a lot of value out of these guys. I highly recommend. It changed my fundamental approach to growth from one of really kind of a mental model of a funnel where, and funnel is an extremely useful mental model, obviously, right? You want to kind of understand your funnels and you want to measure them and make sure that you're optimizing them. But by their very nature, you get less output out of the bottom of a funnel than is put in at the top. The kind of new framework that I've embraced is this loop model, where essentially you have an input, very often a new or returning user, and then through some form of action produces an output which can be reinvested in the input. So a classic example of this would be a viral loop, right? So somebody comes on to Lingvist, they learn, they go, holy crap, I'm learning really fast. They tell their friends, that produces more new users, right? So that's a qualitative way to look at it, but you can actually look at it quantitatively, and we were able to measure this by isolating certain countries. And granted, all countries don't perform the same, but still, we found that this was about 22% per cycle, which means about 28% over time. If that makes sense, if you get 100 people who create 22, those 22 create another 4 or 5, et cetera, you get about 28 altogether. So we thought, okay, this is great. What else can we do around this? So we created an incentivized referral loop program where, if somebody learned and then told their friend about it and that person learned, then both people got a free month. And when we measured this, the output was not nearly as good. So essentially what we chose to do over time was actually can this, right? But I kept it in here just to kind of give you a sense of what types of loops there are. Which brings me to the kind of core of the talk, a paid user acquisition loop. Same thing though, right? Newer returning user comes in, some of them become subscribers. We conceptually anyway take that money and buy ads. Now, we all know, being kind of venture-funded startups, you don't always use exactly the money that comes in, but the idea is, do you earn more money off of those subscribers to buy enough ads to buy more new users? A couple other loops. Company-generated content/SEO. So we take some of that money, we invest it in content that gets us searches, People come, people join Lingvist, we create new users. Earned media, we use some of that money, we pay a PR firm, they create earned media, they create new users, they come around. And all these things can be essentially put together into one model. And so if I'm asked to describe how does Lingvist grow, this is my answer to that question. So what you can see at the center of this is the kind of new or returning user. On the bottom, we have some of this. There's the word of mouth loop. Here's the incentivized referral loop that we canceled ultimately. Here's our course sharing loop, Course Wizard sharing loop. We have a feature in the product called Course Wizard where you can spin up a course in a matter of seconds. So let's say you're an EMT from Ohio who's moved to San Diego. You may want to learn a lot of words like, hey, in Spanish, I'm gonna stop the bleeding, I'm gonna put a splint on. You're not gonna find those kind of words necessarily in kind of a basic Spanish course, but you can spin it up really fast. And if this EMT does this and she wants to share that course with her friends, she can do it very easily. On the top, we have essentially company-driven loops. So these are where we've taken and we've spent money on PR, we've spent money on content, we've essentially attracted users that we've created earned media, and then there's our paid user acquisition loop. So why do I go through the trouble of going through all these loops discussion? Well, first of all, I firmly believe that growth comes from loops. There's a lot of value in identifying and amplifying your core loops, which in our case are word of mouth and paid UA. And then understanding and building a system of supporting loops, right, so that you can get this compounding effect. So the reason being is that when the paid loop spins, you guys probably can jump to this conclusion already, but the other loops spin too. Boy, I really should have looked at the fonts on that machine, but that's too bad. So in other words, every user that comes in through an ad, or every 100 users, is also going to tell 22 of their friends, and that bottom loop is going to spin as well, right? And all of these loops are going to spin. So why we care about this is because, and this gets to be the wonkiest part, and from here, I swear to God, I'm going to show you some fun creative. It's going to be downhill from here. But for those of you who aren't really familiar with what kind of ROAS and LTV over CAC is, I'm going to walk you through it just on this one slide. So have a sip of coffee. So if ROAS is the total of all first purchases divided by the customer acquisition cost. So in other words, we buy a bunch of people, buy a bunch of ads, a bunch of people come to the product, and some of them buy subscriptions. They buy 1 month, they buy 12 months, they buy lifetime, et cetera. And we take all that gross amount of money and we divide it by the customer acquisition cost. That's our ROAS. So let's say we spend 1,000, we get 800 back, our ROAS is 0.8. ROI, or LTV over CAC, is the net revenue from all those purchases. So basically, now we have to take out the platform fees, Apple and Google take their cut, taxes, et cetera, but we get all of the renewals from those people. Plus, we get all of the output of all the other loops that spun as a result of them coming into the product. So LTV over CAC is the net revenue after taxes and platform fees of all of that kind of loop activity and renewals, which isn't reflected in the model. So for us, this calculation, this ratio is extremely important. And we've figured out that currently, our 14-month LTV, we use that to make sure we get kind of the 1-year subscription people renewing, equals CAC to the ROAS. No, I'm sorry. ROAS of 30 days times 2. So basically, we double our ROAS approximately right now, and we get our LTV over CAC. And that number is rising. That ratio is rising over time. But this is critically important because it tells us that if we have a ROAS of 0.8, our LTV over CAC is actually 1.6 for that campaign. Okay, that's the wonky part over. Now, creative process. In the context of a loop, what's improving your creative process really doing? By making better ads, you're going to get higher quality or more users into your funnel, right? Which means a greater likelihood for those people to pay, which means higher all the metrics that you love. Conversion rates, ARPU, ARPU, ROAS, et cetera, which in turn justifies more ad spend, justifies more investment in better creative. So if we go back to this plot of our increasing ROAS, I'm going to break down kind of as we've improved our creative and our creative process, what the impact has been. We started out with some just real simple persona definitions. We got attribution in place, of course, because that's critical. And we executed on some simple ads. This is a one-man show, actually, at this point, as I was building the team. As a side note, I'm not going to go into real detail here, but just to make sure everybody knows, we did better geo-targeting, and we started doing better training data, right? You want the right events within your application to kind of train Google and algorithms and Facebook lookalike audiences. And then basically we moved on to adding to our kind of in-house creative team. We hired a full-time designer for the growth team specifically. We got kind of access to, 60% of the time copywriter. And then last but not least, we did kind of major in-house improvements to the creative process, and we engaged some agencies. So let's look at some of this stuff. So first, we defined our personas. I alluded to it in the beginning, but we look at kind of people who are learning languages on this motivational spectrum. So there's people who really don't care, and that's not really our market. There's people who basically like language learning as a form of kind of brain training, keeping your brain active. But they'd be pretty much just as happy with Sudoku or any number of kind of, games, etc. Then there are people who are kind of like, yeah, I took French in high school. It'd be really cool to kind of learn that again, right? There's no reason I should let that get so rusty. Then it moves into somebody, hey, you know what? I'm going to Barcelona for 2 weeks next year. I want to freaking be able to order in Spanish or whatever. Then it starts to get into people for whom learning a language makes a significant difference. We have there's actually a guy who's now become a friend of mine who is a high school student in Arizona whose parents refused to pay for any college for him. He learned German with the app. He's now studying computer science in Germany, paying about, I think, $200 or $300 a semester. Basically it enabled essentially a free college education for him that he wouldn't have had. Same is true in other countries, right? Learning English opens up a whole lot of economic opportunities that you wouldn't have. And then so on up the motivational spectrum. So a company like Duolingo does a fantastic job of making language learning easy and fun. On the other end, you've got kind of one-on-one tutoring platforms, and we kind of live somewhere in the middle. So if we live in the middle, who are we actually attacking? And it's expats, so people living in other countries like me, who want to learn a language where they're located. It's again these people who, for whom people in China, Ukraine, who for them learning English makes a huge difference. It's students, like I talked about, who get tested. So this is some of our amazing first generation creative, or actually even second generation creative, if you can believe that. But it still at least took into account this persona. Take your language learning to the next level. Is your French a bit stuck, etc. And it was responsible for some of this growth. Next time we brought in, better in-house production, had a huge upgrade in the quality of our ads, and that showed up in our user acquisition. I think this thing will play automatically. Yeah, there we go.
Choose.
That also kind of previewed a little bit of what the app looks like. A lot of it is kind of a fill in the blank with your word. So that gave people, I think, a better kind of chance of success once they hit the app. And that improved, essentially, our ROAS. And then last but not least, we changed our in-house process. We went from kind of targeting, hey, let's make a good ad, to let's make a ton of ads. So anybody use OKRs in their company? Oh, come on, wake up. Really? All right, cool. All right, so for those of you who don't, this is a great book. I'm going to go back a slide so you can actually see this. I think this works. Does this work? Yeah. So we moved our OKRs. We used to kind of aim for this ROAS number. We got to get better ROAS, right? So critical. Okay, we're just going to put out a ton of concepts, right? We're going to basically become a machine, and we're going to try a lot of different stuff and throw a lot of things at the wall, and then as we come later and test it really fast. The next thing we did, or in order to make that happen, we started with these kind of weekly AdCept meetings, so weekly concept meetings. And after we got it going, we opened it up to the entire company. Anybody could come and become part of the creative team for the week or whatever. But they had to prepare. You had to come showing a concept, and ideally it had to be something that was fairly quickly executable and testable. And then if any of these ideas showed any kind of promise, we would then invest larger kind of creative resources to hone them. And then last but not least is we pulled in some external resources, researched and selected a couple of agencies, and gave them all the information they possibly could have, all of our failures, all of our successes, etc. And last but not least is we kind of upgraded our data so that we had daily cohorts, made analytics very, very easy, made early response much, much better so that we could test all these kind of hypotheses. So let me show you a couple examples. So this is one, this is kind of, we call this a placement test ad. So this is a bit of a challenge, you know, how good is your Spanish, how good is your French? Give people an idea of what types of words they might learn at various levels. Kind of encourage them to kind of test themselves, and then many of the people that test want to kind of go on and learn a language. Because of this new process, we were able to respond very quickly to things. Does anybody kind of, did this news make it over here to the US? So I don't know, they're really into the royals over there, but basically, so Meghan and Harry took off to Canada, so we produced this piece. And it performed pretty well, and not only did it perform well, but I think people freaking loved it. Social media really thought this was great. So I think as much as they love the royals, they love to make fun of them. And then here's a piece that was done by one of our external agencies. Cool. All right. So for those that want to play a game, not required, but if you want to vote on which of these do you think produced kind of the best ROAS, let's just say for the first 2 weeks running, whoever wants to vote can vote. Who thinks A? Awesome. And who thinks B? I'm taking all your names down. Okay, great. And C? All right, awesome. So the answer, smart crowd, was A, actually, although C was a fairly close second. As you can imagine, we get massive click-through on A, but not as good deep funnel metrics. Very, very high CPI for C, but very, very good deep funnel metrics. And A, you know, B had kind of a brief moment in the sun, but I think was more a branding piece, as it turned out for us, than a successful thing. So anyway, with a bunch of text that runs together, you can see that was our creative process. The last thing that I'll talk about in depth is activation. Again, I credit Reforge for this. This is for maybe the more producty people in the room. You might really get a kick out of this, or maybe you already know it. But activation, the way that Reforge defines it, and I really embraced, is that moment from the point where kind of a user has kind of opened your front door, right? They've installed the app, and they're kind of ready, and they're kind of wondering, hey, is this going to do what I want it to do? Is this going to be fun if it's a game? Whatever it is, it's going to satisfy my intrinsic needs. And then on the other side of this, at some point, they discover value in the product. They go, and then they habituate that value. And some point later, they're like, yeah, this is great. And I'm a regular habituated user. So, and the reason well, for us, this is really key because Lingvist isn't immediately obvious, the value. You kind of go, okay, this looks like other language learning apps, but it takes a little while for people to kind of have that aha moment when they start to kind of, when the spaced repetition algorithm starts to kind of give them the same words that they got wrong. So you have to actually use the app long enough to get some stuff wrong and then get it back in the right amount of time frame where you suddenly go, oh my God, like just as I'm about to forget this, I'm getting the right words. Whereas something like, let's just say, I don't know, a ride sharing company, right? The first time I got out of an Uber, I went, wow, that was 10x better than anything I'd ever experienced. And I had that aha moment right there, and it didn't take me very long to habituate. I'll come back to this. Anybody that's in growth long enough knows that retention is really the heart of growth. For me, I really like the way it was framed. For me, when your retention curve flattens, which sounds like a bad thing, but then you're actually in good shape, right? If every new cohort that you have essentially trends to zero at some point over time, then it doesn't matter how many new people you acquire, at some point your growth plateaus. When at least some portion of your user base sticks around, and then you can essentially build a stacked kind of user base based on cohort after cohort, that's when you actually have sustained growth. Now, when is this flat retention? How do you define this? It's completely different for everybody, right? So something with a daily engagement cycle, like WhatsApp or Facebook, and I have no idea these, I'm making up these numbers, but it's probably something like a month. If you stick around with that app for a month, you're probably going to stick around with it for pretty much the foreseeable future. But like take a tax service, right? The cycle there, the engagement cycle is probably annually. I don't know what they consider flat retention. Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? But it's probably something like that. For Lingvist, it's weekly. So if you're going to learn something, learn a language, you've got to at least invest pretty much weekly in it. Otherwise, you kind of work backwards. It's kind of like working out, right? You got to work out a fairly regular amount of time. So for us, we define flat engagement as 12 weeks. This is what our actual simplified retention curve for all users looks like. So if anybody you're thinking about ed tech, you can now run screaming for the doors. So we lose, again, about 85% of our people in the first week. Learning is hard, especially on Lingvist sometimes. But then we do have this kind of sliver that sticks around. And it's trending towards zero, but very, very, very slowly. So we looked at a ton of different behaviors that people did in the beginning. Was it the language they were learning? Was it some feature that they had? Was it voice recognition that they were using? Was it this course wizard feature? What was it that essentially led to people sticking around? And we found that actually people that did at least 50 cards a session and then did kind of multiple sets of these 50 cards had very, very nice flat retention curves at a very, very much higher rate. So we did an analysis and said, okay, what behavior pattern, including all these other activities like voice recognition and so on and so forth, in the first month is actually predictive of 12th week retention. And again, what we found, it was these 50 card sets, basically. And if somebody did 8 50-card sets, 8 sessions in the app of at least 50 of these flashcards, then basically they were very likely to stick around through the 12th week. So then we backed it up one step further and went, okay, if that's what it takes kind of to form a habit in the first month, what does it take to have that first aha moment, right? What does it take to really actually get that the app has some really cool value? And there's a couple of things that were predictive of that. But again, to keep it simple, we said, okay, look, if somebody does 4 sets of 50 cards in the first week, then they're actually very likely to do the habit forming behavior and do another 4 sets by the end of the month or more. And so this is what we aligned on, and we just built a very, very simple new onboarding system that encouraged this. So we used to kind of let people do 100 card sets, but we reduced it and we noted this thing at the bottom where they could kind of go to 50 and they could see where that was coming. Once they did it, we gave them some positive feedback. We showed them where that was kind of in the grand scheme of things. So in this case, this is their second set of 4 that they'd done. Every time they came back to the app or to the hub, we would show them kind of what they'd done, what they had left to do. And so you may be wondering, like, okay, does this really work? Does just kind of, shoehorning a habit into people actually impact their kind of longer term metrics, right? And the truth is, apparently, yes, at least for us, at least to some extent. So this top line is people who did four sets in the first week. And this is, so we started, this is when kind of this new sets and sessions framework kind of launched. We did it in an A/B test, so for a number of months, we didn't roll it out to everybody, and then you can kind of see it goes up again, and that's when we rolled it out to the second half of the group. So we literally got 135% more people doing four 50-card sets in the first week. We got 63%, then that translated into a whole bunch more people doing the 28-day metric, right, of 8 sets, and that led to ARPU of plus 19%. And that's like permanent now, baked in, right? So when we actually look at this graph that I attributed before to all creative, this section right here was actually the introduction of sets and sessions, and then like I said, it now then rolls out across all the platforms and has that impact. Just in case you're wondering, as I would be, like, what the hell goes on in October? I don't know, but basically we suffer some really bad seasonality in October. People like, yeah, like, I'm not gonna learn a language in October, what are you kidding me? So anyway, all right, so that's really it. Talked a little about surfers and grinders, talked about the loop model, talked about how we built our creative process and how we improved activation. activation, which gave us about a 20% increase in ROAS just alone. Value of loops essentially let us understand what the relationship between ROAS and LTV over CAC was and kind of monitor that over time as it changes. Our creative process allowed us to build some really fast ads, even if this one wasn't the most successful, and led to that kind of growth. So, we're still in the grind zone, but as you can kind of see from that graph, and the latest results look quite as good as well. We may be starting to hit that inflection point, so it's possible that perhaps if I'm invited back in a year, we'll be surfing. All right, that's it. Thanks.